class. We welcome you into our classroom. We are continuing our tracing of the tribes of Israel. And again, I'm going to just tell you the purpose of why we are doing this is to show you that God made promises to a people. And here we are, some 3,000 years later. Guess what? The promises are true, and we're watching them be fulfilled. And I hope what that does is build faith in you to know God's given me some promises too. And faithful is he who promised, who also shall bring it to pass. By the way, that's 1 Thessalonians 5:24. Faithful is he who promised, who also shall bring it to pass. And I always remember that because this date is the birthday of a friend, and 1 Thessalonians 5:24 happens to be her favorite scripture. Okay. 1 Chronicles, chapter 5, verse 26. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He carried, this is what we're looking at, he carried the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Now to let you know, kind of refresh your memory with this, remember Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. When they entered into the promised land, they had already asked Moses, before they ever entered into the promised land, they said, when we want to expand because we have grown, we have prospered, and we would like to move to the east side of the Jordan River. And so Moses had said, yes, providing that you stay and fight until your brethren are settled, safely settled. So you're not just, oh, well, we'll go over here because we won't have to fight. If you'll do that, then yes. And that's exactly what they did. When they entered the promised land, that's basically what happened. So what happened then is that the king of Assyria carried the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh into captivity. And this was before the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, in 586 BC. And so he took them to, so now we know where initially Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were taken, because the Bible tells us where they were taken. And so therefore we can go back there to begin to trace where they went and where they ended up. So he took them to Hala, Habor, Hara, and the river of Gozan to this day. Now when this says to this day, it's talking about at the time of the penning of 1 Chronicles. So at the penning of 1 Chronicles, they were still there. So the tribe of Gad was exiled alongside Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh to Hala, Habor, and river of Gozan, and to Hara, Hara. And those areas are areas in North Syria, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and eastern Iran. Okay. So understand if you have your map, that you have a map that it will show you Hara. Okay. It's the one that says Israel's wanderings. The map that says Israel's wanderings. And if you will look, well, you will see Media, and then right above that is the Caspian Sea, and you will see what? You will see Hala, Habor, Hara. Okay? And That was primarily the area in which they were exiled. And also eastern Iran, which is a little bit further up. So in Hebrew, and this is what becomes very important when you're tracing where the tribes went, another way of pronouncing the name Gad is Goth. Goth, G-O-T-H. Now this becomes important when we start tracing the tribe, because Gad, the tribe of Gad that we know as Gad, that we call Gad, which in Hebrew would have been pronounced Goth, are kind of a cross between Gath and Goth. Okay. So Gad reappeared as the Guti, G-U-T-I. How many know we have looked at people with something as a name Guti? And they were allied. In other words, they were friends. They were compatriots to the Saka and the Gemiri, or the Kimeri. Remember the Kimerians that we were looking at, or the Sumerians in Mesopotamia and the Zagros mountain regions, which was further north. Now, another people of that name, okay, had been in that area centuries before. Centuries before. So the Neo-Assyrian practice, so these basically new Assyrians, was to allocate old terms and names to contemporary entities. Now, actually, that's something that Rome did to the nation of Israel. You may know what Rome did as a punishment to Israel by using an old term to name. Okay, all right? They wanted to insult the nation of Israel. And so they said, from now on, this is Aeoli Capitolina, but this is the area of Palestina, named after the Philistines. And by the way, so that should tell you something. There is no such thing as a Palestinian, because the name, the term, was literally conjured up by the Romans to insult the Israelis and the Yehudahites by laying on top of their nation the name of an old enemy. So we see that, therefore, the Gadites, G-A-D-I-T-E-S, were named Guti. And in this case, it was not done to stamp the name of an enemy. It was just that, okay, this was the area, and all the people who lived there a long, long time ago were called Gutis, and now we've moved you here, you're Gutis too. So from this area around the Caspian Sea and a little bit west, you have the Guti splitting into groups. And one group went west to become the Geti of the Balkans, okay? The Balkan states. So you can see them moving up. You can see Goths in this map. Yeah. So they began to move into the Balkans. If you are going to on your own do some tracing of the tribes, you're going to see that the Geti and the Goths were basically recognized as the very same people group. So if you're looking at Goths or you're looking at Geti, they're the same people group. Another group of Goths branched out east, so they went from Hara, which is on the west side of the Caspian Sea, and this time they're going to branch out, believe it or not, east. So they're going to go this way from Hara to eastern Iran. So now you see a group going west, group going east, same people group. Now in the Persian-Iranian area, the Gadites then reappeared because now they're going into an area of Iran, Persia, and so they're going to take on what they are going to be called by the Persians, which was Pasar Gadai. It still has the Gad because that, but now they're going to take on Pasar Gadai. Then they became, and on one of your maps you have Carmania, and they became the Gadrosia of Carmania, same people group, just different portions of the same people group. And then they became the plain old Gude. Now, some people, and I will tell you, you may find this online. What you're going to find online is that the name Gute is sometimes mistakenly translated from Chinese records as Yu Qi. Now there were Yu Qi, but you have to be very careful there, because the Gute were known to the Western world as Masagetai. And there were some Getais who were also Yu Qi, but they weren't the Masagetai. Now remember, the Masagetai were placed by the Assyrians on their eastern border, on the eastern border of Assyria, because they thought, well, after all, we have exiled these, we have overcome, we've exiled them, and rather than use their own soldiers, because if people are going to get run over or killed, better to be the people we have captured and exiled, rather than sacrificing our own soldiers. So what they did, they would put them along the border. But here's what happened. They were warriors. And when they put them on the border, and I would simply say, look at God's promises. You'll be the head, not the tail. Wherever you go, you're going to rise. And so what they found out, these are really great warriors. And what they did was basically protected that border until it was time for another providential nation to rise. And by the way, God said, I raised up Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. So the name Goth itself, by the way, means Gad, and is another way of pronouncing it in Hebrew. And believe it or not, the Goths, in some cases, actually referred to themselves by the term Gad. Now, even though many of these tribes forgot their tribal identity, there's still something in the back of their mind, and so they referred to themselves by the term Gad. The Goths are also recorded as having called themselves Gouda, G-U-D-A, and that is not supposed to be good. It's supposed to be Godo, and I'm going to give it to you, G-O-D-O. And here's what happened. But this is one mistake that's not my fault. How many know what happened? I had a self-correcting computer that says there is no word such as Godo. Well, I will just change it to good, and I didn't pick it up until I had run them all off. Okay. And I even have a note here, computer changed this. Now the Goths were found among the various northern tribes who invaded England with the Anglo-Saxons. England, England. And now, what do you see? Now I'm going to ask you a question. What do you see happening? Why would the Goths join with the Anglo-Saxons in invading England? Because birds of a feather flock together, and even though they had lost their tribal identities, they didn't know who they were. But they said, well, you know, we're kind of like these people, and we're kind of like-minded. Joined with the Anglo-Saxons. And remember, the term Saxon comes from whose name? Isaac. So the main body of Gad, the main people group, was associated with the Goths and with the so-called, now we're moving along, Nordic, N-O-R-D-I-C, Nordic peoples. So Goths were to settle in many different lands, but numerically, they probably remained concentrated in our friend Sherry's favorite word, Scandinavia. Scandinavia. Sweden, S-W-E-D-E-N, Sweden, is the only place where today they can be distinguished as a specific people group. In other words, everywhere else they went, they've been amalgamated. They've basically been absorbed by the people groups that were in these other countries. Only in Sweden is there a distinguishable specific people group that are the Goths, and that is in Sweden. Now I want us to turn in our Bibles to Genesis 46:16. Because we're going to look at the sons of Gad, because the sons of Gad will become what? They will become the clans of Gad. So the sons of Gad were Ziphion, Haggi, or Haggai, Shuni, Esbon, Eri, Arodi, and Areli. And then let's look at Numbers 26. That is the book of Numbers. Verse 26 and verse 15. The sons of Gad, according to their families, were of Zephon, the family of the Zephonites, of Haggi, the family of the Haggites, of Shuni, the family of the Shunites, of Ozni, the family of the Oznites, of Eri, the family of the Erites, and of Arad, the family of the Aradites, of Aredi, the family of the Arelites. Okay? So they're on there. The sons of Gad were Ziphion, and in Hebrew, it's a Zadi. It's spelled with the letter Zadi. Ziphion, Haggi, which can also be spelled with the CH sound because it's the same sound, Haggi. Shuni, Esbon, Etzbon, it can also be Etzbon. Eri, sometimes Geri, and that is because as they migrated, the name mutated. Arodi and Areli. Now Ziphion's descendants were the Thiphalil, tried to say that 20 times, who were close allies of the Goths. So here's what happens. You had the Goths, and then you had these people migrating at different times, but when they began to get in the same area, they allied together. And they came westward from the east with the Hun, Hun invasion. And they settled in France. Now, when you think about a son by the name of Haggai or Haggai, and you know that some of these people settled in France, is anyone connecting some dots with a name?
Somewhat.
Okay, maybe I'll give you this and you'll hit it. The name Haggai is close to that of Huga, which was the name applied to the Franks in the north. The Franks in the north. How about Huguenots? Now the Franks, and remember that, I know it's been almost before the flood when we studied the tribe of Reuben, but I may remember some things we looked at there. So the Franks consisted mainly, not completely, but mainly of clans from Reuben, R-E-U-B-E-N. But we must remember that the two tribes, Gad and Reuben, what do we know about Gad and Reuben? Well, they had been together on the other side of the Jordan River. When they took their tribal allotments, you had Gad and Reuben and a half tribe of Manasseh that went on the other side of the Jordan River. So guess where? They were living in the land of Israel pre-exile, together, next door to each other. So they were joined to each other. And they were also, according to the Bible, exiled together, right? The Bible tells us that Gad, Reuben, and half tribe of Manasseh were exiled together. So it would be a natural occurrence for groups of one tribe to be found in the territory of the other tribe. So the descendants of Haggai, and that's it's not, even though it's spelled with a CH, it's still Huggy, not Chuggy, are found in the Hauki and Hauchi. That's not Chauchi, okay? Or Chachi. That's another program. And they were a Frisian nation whose land, and that was not were, was overtaken in 200 AD, and isn't this interesting, by Saxons, S-A-X-O-N-S. So now we're seeing that even some of the tribes were overtaken by other of their family because they didn't realize they were a family. So here come the Saxons, we're going to take care of these Huggy people. And they overtook them. Never knowing what? This is family. Now the Hauchi were forced to leave their lands, and because why? Because the Saxons came in and became amalgamated with the Franks, never knowing, guess what? These Franks are some of the people who are descended from our ancestors, and they lived together on the eastern side of the Jordan River together. They were a joined tribe. They joined together. However, some of the Hauchi were absorbed by the Saxons, which is, again, not strange. Why? Because the Saxons are brothers too, though they may not realize it. Now, the historian Tacitus describes the Hauchi as the noblest of Germanic tribes. And I didn't just put that in there, Germanic, G-E-R-M-A-N-I-C, Germanic tribes. And I didn't just throw that in because the historian Tacitus said that. I said it for a reason. How many know it fulfills the prophetic word here? Noblest of tribes. Why? because those are the promises God gave to these people. Now there was also a people named Chalci. Some of these names are a little bit in Celtic. And like I said, I have family members that can speak Celtic. I'm not one of them. Okay. And actually, I was with some of them this past weekend, and thank goodness they didn't speak Celtic. And they were a people in Celtic Ireland, Ireland. And DNA results tell us that the Calci in Celtic Ireland were related to the Calci. In other words, if you do DNA, they have the same DNA profile. So that tells us what? They're the same people group. They may have different names, went different places, they're the same people group. And I would just throw out to you, if you've ever had your DNA done, and then what they'll do is they will email you, right? And they will say, you have DNA relatives, and you start looking at your relatives, and they can be all over the world. Why? Because migrations. Now, the central area of the Goths, when they sojourned in the Balkans, was known, guess what? As Caucaland. Caucaland. Now, the Batavia, this is a people group, who settled in Holland, Holland. And I don't know what happened. I'm going to give you the rest of this sentence because it got erased. That was probably my fault. I was probably going fast and hit something. So were, W-E-R-E, a part, P-R-T, of the Chauci, C-H-A-U-C-I. So the Batavian, they were called Batavia, a whole different name, but they were part of these. They settled in Holland. They were a part of the Chauci, C-H-A-U-C-I. And these people formed a contingent from Gad, the tribe of Gad, G-A-D, among, guess what? The Dutch population. So what do we know? They keep moving. Some of the families keep moving. How many of you sitting in front of me, and those of you at home, think about this, have relatives who live in different parts, let's say just of the country, different states? I have different states, maybe even different countries. Some of us have relatives in different countries. Well, it's the same with these people. As they're moving, they go different places, but guess what? Then all of a sudden they find, oh, these people are the same people. They're the same family. Now, Gad's sons, Haggi, and like I said, Haggi can be spelled either with an H or a CH. It's the same in Hebrew. And Eri, which also can be Gary, same people group spelled a little bit differently, were represented by tribes of East Scythia. Now, either in this map, in this map you see where Scythia is. It's north of the Caspian Sea. This is the Israel Wanderings map that you should have. If not, see me. If you're in class, see me and I will make sure you get this. If you're at home, you can call the number of the church and we will be happy to mail you one of these. But above the Caspian Sea, and then you all should have this map of Scythia, which is a larger map of Scythia. And I say that so you can know what I'm talking about. They were the tribes of East Scythia. So that's where they primarily, when they first migrated, that's where they primarily settled. And they then, in the west, as they went from East Scythia and started moving westward, toward basically Europe, they became associated with the Goths, Goths. So you still see what? Descendants of Gad. And the Suebians. Now also in Syrica, were a number of other groups, as they kept moving westward, were a number of other groups who later reappeared in the west, so they're moving, and they were of Israelite descent. Israelite. Now, one of these groups were the Garanai, and these were descendants of Eri, pronounced Gary in Hebrew, and just because and when you look at that word, trust me, in Hebrew it has a guttural sound, Gary. And they, guess what? They reappeared, because remember I told you most of them ended up in Scandinavia? Well, these people reappeared as the Graini of Sweden. Because they keep moving, and they will end up in Sweden as the Graini. Oh, now you get the really good one. Some of you have turned the page and you saw it already, and that's another one of the thingies. Now, the Gruthingi. You're having more fun than junior high students have, right, when you see it, right? Every time we get these people groups. And these are actual people groups. I'm not making this up. The Gruthingi were also from Erie or Gary. And they were a section now, guess what, of the Goths, so we're still dealing with what then? We know right away we're dealing with what? The tribe of Gad. And they mingled with the Ostrogoths on the Black Sea coast. So they're moving westward. Remember, they started over here. Now they're moving westward along the Black Sea. And guess what? Then they join family. Only they don't know their family. But they're joining with other family members because they're joining with the Ostrogoths, which were called the East Goths, on the Black Sea coast. And these people on the Black Sea coast are the same people as the, here we go, Griotingi. So now you have the Gruthingi. You have, these people will get you one day. The Gruthingi are now intermingling with the Griotingi. And where do you think these people groups ended up? Sweden. They were reported as being in Sweden. So that leads us to a conclusion. As we follow the migration path of the Goths, which are from the tribe of Gad, we know that they are traditionally considered, I'm talking about the Goths that then went into much of Europe and did their thing. They were considered to have come from Sweden. But guess what? We know what? They came farther back than Sweden. They ended up in Sweden to move from there, but they had come from far, far away, all the way over by the Caspian Sea. And they had moved from the Caspian Sea to the area of the Black Sea, into Sweden, and from there to other parts of the world. Now, Sweden, the nation of Sweden, was formed when the kingdom of the Swedish Goths, and there were many groups of Goths, right?
Numbers 26.
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped a whole note. Okay. I guess it's because I was into the thingies.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at Numbers 26. And I would simply say to you, is God a big God?
Yes.
Yes, he is. Does he have a big plan? Oh, yes, he does. So, we already read this, okay? So let me read it again. The sons of Gad, according to their families, were of Zephon, the family of Zephonites, of Haggi, the family of the Haggites, of Shuni, the family of the Shunites, of Ozni, the family of the Oznites, of Eri, the family of the Erites, of Arad, the family of the Aradites, of Areli, the family of the Arelites. These are the families of the sons of Gad, according to those who were numbered of them. Now there's 40,500.
Wow.
40,500. Now the Dans, who were the descendants of Dan, and we remember back when we studied Dan, one of the first tribes we did, who finally settled in Denmark. Now they finally settled in Denmark and stamped their name on it because it was actually, in Hebrew it's the same, right? Denmark or Danmark, it's spelled the same way in Hebrew. So they finally settled in Denmark, had formerly lived where? Sweden. And so they had formerly lived in Sweden where the tribe of Gad predominated. What I want you to see that as they're moving, the tribes are constantly intermingling with one another, meeting their family. And by the way, the name Sweden was formed then when the kingdom of the Swedish Goths, Gautland, united with the kingdom of Svi, whose people were known as Suonis. And the name Suona or Svi is similar to the Hebrew Shuni, the third son of Gad. Suonis, Suoni, Svi, Shuni. And Shuni's name in biblical times was, believe it or not, pronounced Suoni. 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 Let me get together. So, I would simply say, this lets you know, as the tribes migrated, and they came into another area, and they would say, what is your name? Now, we would read that name today as Shuni, but they're pronouncing it as they would pronounce their name in Hebrew, Suoni. So they're again, oh, you're Suones. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or Suonis? So they're picking it up and they're putting it into their language, and that gets stamped onto these people. Now the union of Gad and Dan, who were close neighbors prior to the Assyrian exile, because there was a part of them that lived close together, was repeated in the Gauti and Downy of Sweden. Okay? In other words, they were close when they were in the land of Israel, and as they migrated, they end up close together after the exile. So when they get to Sweden, if you look at a map of Sweden, you will see that the Gauti and the Downy of Sweden were very close to each other. And as they migrate, as they continue to migrate, they end up together. They end up together. Isn't that true of ethnic communities?
Yes.
No. I can name you particular neighborhoods in Canton that were particular ethnic neighborhoods. Some of you are kind of going there and they go, okay, I know. And there were certain neighborhoods that were certain to certain ethnic areas. I told you, my parents
lived in a neighborhood. In fact, it was the last house my parents lived in before my mother. After the death of my father, we lived here. And we lived on the border between a Greek neighborhood and a Syrian neighborhood. And I've told you this, after some of you know this story. And then, of course, you know a little bit of my ethnic background, Irish, but another ethnicity. And so, okay, when you live in that neighborhood and you go to school, you know what happens. And I started dating a Syrian boy. And I heard from my mother often. And I laughed about this mantra she had, because she said, "Can't you just find a nice Jewish boy?" Now let me tell you something. That mantra from my mother went from, "Can't you find a nice Jewish boy? Can't you find a nice Jewish young man? Can't you find a nice Jewish middle-aged man?" to "Can't you find a nice Jewish old man?" And I could share something with you, but I won't. As you know, my mother and I belong to the Canton Jewish Community Center. And I'm not even going to say what happened, but they had some interesting things that happened at the meetings. And on one of them, I will only say this, that nice Jewish old man surfaced, and he said he would do something if he could do something. And not bad. I might as well just tell you. He said, "I will do this if she will kiss me." And my mother looks at me with a smile on her face. And I said, "Okay." And I went over and I kissed him on the cheek. Made my mother happy. But what happens is, and the bottom line is ethnic people tended, and by the way, I was able to go back and forth when they would play ball games, or when, there was a field behind us that eventually they took and built an apartment complex, but prior to that was a big field. And so when the Greek kids played against the Syrian kids, which that was how the teams broke, I could play for either person who was ever short one. No pun. So we were able to do that. But back in, and I'm talking about up until actually the early 70s, that's how it was there. There were ethnic neighborhoods, and for the most part, people stayed in their neighborhoods. Now I go there and it's like, wow, there is no ethnic neighborhood in that little community. So all I'm saying is, do you understand why, when these tribes traveled, that happened? Because there was something they had in common. It was customs, maybe it was food, what they ate, but there were characteristics that they had in common, and they ended up next to each other. The Arodi and Areli of Gad were also linked with Denmark of Dan. And by the time that happened, they didn't realize that they were related, but they were. And by the way, back in those days, they didn't yet have DNA. Okay, so they didn't know. They just kind of flocked together. Now the Harudi, which were the descendants of Arodi, migrated to Norway. And the Aruli, who are the descendants of Areli, so we're talking about Arodi, and we're talking about the Areli, who were what? Brothers. They were brothers. They were also known as Harules, or Hurules, and they were expelled from Norway. In other words, for some reason, they said, you need to keep moving. And they were expelled between 100 and 500 AD. How many know that's a long time from the time they were originally exiled and started their migration? And they, guess where they settled? Sweden. See, you're following a pattern now. So what are you seeing? They're ending up in basically the same place. Ezbon or Etzbon of Gad fathered the Hasdingas. And they were a branch of the Vandals. Remember last week we talked about Vandals in a different tribe, remember? So a branch of the Hasdingas, guess what? They also participated in the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain. Again, why? Well, because there was a commonality there. Even though they didn't know what the commonality was they had been brothers. Their ancestors had been brothers. They didn't know that, but when it came, there they were again, allying with one another. And there, now you should understand this one, they were known by the term Hastings, Hastings. If you know history, you have probably heard about the Battle of Hastings. And Hastings is Hastings. Again, you see them migrating different times through different paths, but ending up at some point together. Ezbon, who was also called Ozni, and by the way, when we looked at it in Genesis, then we looked at it in Numbers. Ozni is the same person as Ezbon. And his name is found in Osnabrück, which by the way is what? German. In West Germany. Now, you know that France and Germany are what? Side by side. So this location, now Osnabrück, which is located in West Germany, was once in Frankish territory or French territory. Remember what I said, when you're watching the migration of the tribes, you need to understand that what? Borders back then were very fluid. How many have taken their DNA and it's come out you're part Iberian? Okay. Because the reason why it's Iberian is, and they can't nail it down whether it's Portuguese or Spanish, and it's because the borders were fluid. And so they just say, you're from this area. We can't nail it down on whether it was this or this, but it was in this area because the borders were so fluid at that time. Now, the name Etzbon or Ezbon is also seen in the name of Bastarnae. And the Bastarnae were allied to the Goths. And these people groups seem to have, and I don't know why that's disappeared. That should be disappeared. There should be a D there. Sorry about that. So the Bastarnae all of a sudden appeared, okay, and then all of a sudden they seem to have disappeared. They were moving, obviously, further from Germany into Frankish territory, and they just disappeared somewhere in France. Now this next one's going to be really interesting to some of you, I hope. So they disappeared somewhere in France. In other words, they moved into France and then we never hear about them again, except that the Bastarnae were also called Galatians. Galatians. So the name Galatian comes from the Hebrew Galadi or Gilead, And Gilead was the grandson of Manasseh. Now wait a minute, because this you're going to see this. Because Gilead was the grandson of Manasseh. And what do we know about Manasseh's territory in the land of Israel had intermingled with the territory of Gad? So what do you see with the Galatians? Well, now they've intermingled again with Gad. And now you have a people group who's probably what? A mixture of Manasseh and Gad. Etzbone of Gad then is identified with the Bastarnite, the Hasdingus, and Hastings. And actually, each one of these groups were identified as both Galatians from Gilead, Gilead, and Goths from Gad, Gad. In other words, these three people groups sometimes are identified as being from the Goths from Gad, but they're also identified as being Galatians from Gilead. And most of these groups had settled in Sweden. So again, what do we see? They're getting together. Now remember, when we were doing Hughie and Hagee, remember I said that? Well, Huguenots from Hagee of Gad. The Huguenots are identified as the Calvinist Protestants of France. So in most history books, they are identified as Calvinist Protestants of France, even though they existed long before Calvin. Now, what is so interesting about the Calvinists? If you know anything about Calvinistic doctrine, and that, of course, comes out in what you would know as the Presbyterian Church. But I'm talking about old, and now, like most churches, they have kind of morphed into something else. But the old Presbyterians. Now, if you know something, and I'm just going to say this, the Calvinists were basically Hebraic, Hebraic, in character and mindset when compared to neighboring peoples and religious groups. And to show you, I remember hearing stories that my mother and my grandmother told me about my mother's great-grandmother, who was Protestant, even though her husband and that line and my grandfather were Irish, and that Irish were not Protestant. Okay, but she was a strong Calvinist Presbyterian, and back in the day, they didn't cook on this what was called the Sabbath. Now they moved that day, but don't cook on the Sabbath. Think about this for a minute. And my mother said, when I visited my grandparents, she told me that, she said, there was never any food cooked on the Sabbath. You can do that. It was all done ahead of time. Does that remind you of anything? Yes. And they couldn't even say why. And even though, and they called Sunday the Sabbath, that's how they called it. And plus, she said, we couldn't do anything on that day. Nothing. We couldn't even read the funnies. They had to be put away for the next day. And she was telling me all these things you couldn't do. But when we ask her, here's the key, when we ask her, why do we do that? Well, we Calvinists have always done this. Do you understand something?
I don't know why.
When you understand the Huguenots from Hagi of Gad became the Calvinist Protestants of France. Okay? And they were basically Hebraic. Now, the Huguenots were persecuted. They were persecuted. Persecuted. Now, why would they have been persecuted in France? Because France would have been primarily what? A Catholic nation. And guess what? Hugo is another form of the name Hagi, son of Gad. Now, the chief concentrations of Huguenots today in France, and there are still obviously descendants of the Huguenots in France today, and they are in Vendée in the west, in the region of Paris, Paris. That stands to reason because obviously there's obviously more ability to be in freedom in a larger city. And in areas situated along the Rhone River in the southeast. So they're still there. Now the Huguenots displayed strong Israelite characteristics, strong ones. And actually, they were mainly one ethnic group. In other words, they were mainly one ethnic group. And they came from areas in France where the Goths, G-O-T-H-S, of Gad had once been present. So that's where they came from. Now, the southeast of France was once called Gothia. And that was actually due to the fact that the Goths actually at one time ruled there and obviously settled there. Now here's, if you can put some of this together, the Goths, the Huguenots, if you can put all this together, among the Goths in Gothia, there had been movements to Judaize, J-U-D-A-I-Z-E. In other words, there had been moves to return basically to Jewish roots. And the Goths themselves, so if you research this and come with some of the things that were written during that time, the Goths themselves seem to have believed that they were descended from Israel, I-S-R-A-E-L. And indeed, guess what? They were. Now, any questions or comments? I'm beginning to see the tribe of Gad is moving. Many Goths in southeast France and Spain. So at some point they moved from France into Spain. At some early stage, converted to Judaism. J-U-D-A-I-S-M. And I would simply ask you, why would they be amenable to converting to Judaism? Their heritage. Now, much later, there were Jewish Marranos, Spanish Jews, and that's should be who, had been forced to become Christians. And I will simply say that many Marranos and I've shared this before, but I'll share it again. Many Marranos ended up in the United States, but many of them ended up in areas of Mexico, South America. And you will find that they will have names that are very much Jewish in nature. So, and these people, many of them, also became Huguenots. Huguenots. They became Huguenots. Now, I'm going to say something here why I've merged those together. Here are the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and I use that term deliberately. And they've been exiled, they've migrated at different times, and they're migrating. And now, 722 years later, onto the world scene appears Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua. And then he begins his ministry at 30 years old. And he's ministering, and he's ministering around the area of Judea and Samaria. And there are those who come to him who are not of Yehudahite. They're not Yehudahites. And Jesus says something to them. Now, certainly whosoever will may come. But he says something unique to them. And what he says to them is, do you not know that I have come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel? And then he says to the disciples, when he sends them out, what does he say to them? Only go to those of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And by the way, he was not being ethnically exclusive. There was a reason for that. Now these people, exiled, many of them have migrated into areas. And then Jesus is crucified, raises again, ascends, and the Holy Spirit descends, and Jesus said, wait there until you be endued with power from on high, and then go, because you're going to be my witnesses to Judea, Samaria, to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the othermost parts of the earth. Now, they were really good at doing it in Jerusalem. You know that. They stayed in Jerusalem because, after all, that's where everything happened, and that's all they stayed there. But that's not what Jesus had told them to do. And then what happens? Persecution happens, and they scatter, and they go. And I will tell you that Lazarus and Joseph of Arimathea and Mary and Martha are exiled. They're exiled. They're sent out in a little ship. And they end up in an area. And what do you think they do when they go? They talk about Jesus. Now, why do you think Jesus had ever said in the beginning, go to them? Because they're going to be most receptive. Whosoever will may come. But understand, Gentiles, born Gentiles, fully Gentile, they didn't know anything about this. The Old Covenant. They didn't know. I mean, how do you go to someone And by the way, I don't understand how people can say to me, all we want is the New Testament. Because you cannot understand the largeness of the promises of God in the New Testament until you understand the Old Testament. Once you can understand the tabernacle fully, you can understand the enormity of the atoning work of Christ. Oops. No. Ta-da. So what happened is, who do you think were the first converts? Yeah. The lost sheep of the house of Israel. I believe with all my heart they were the first converts. Now, are there legitimate Gentiles who are being won to the Lord today? Yes, absolutely. But they were first receptive. Why? Because somewhere, and they might not have even realized it, but there was something that was placed in their ancestor, who placed something in their ancestor, who descended, who placed something in their descendant. And they were receptive to the gospel. And you understand that because even as they came all the way across the ocean to the United States of America, they carried with them something and they shared. That's the whole point. By the way, you do know that's why the pilgrims came to this nation. They didn't come here for any other reason but to get religious freedom and preach the gospel. And isn't it interesting that education was established in this country for one purpose and one purpose only, so that people would learn how to read so they could read this. And I would simply challenge you, go and find the purpose for the establishment of Harvard University and Yale University. You may be very shocked. And it's certainly not what's happening there today. But very interesting. So now, I hope that you understand why Jesus said what he said. He said, first, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And guess what? That's happened ever since Jesus commissioned his followers. And it's still going on today. Let me finish up this note and then I am done for the night. So, during World War II, the Huguenots of France, which were the French Protestants, and the Calvinists of Holland, and I want you to see this, probably more than any other groups in Europe, risked their lives to save Jews from extermination by the Nazi regime of Germany. And I'm going to be honest enough to tell you, I don't think they realized why. I don't. But at that time, during World War II, there was just something. Many of them have said, well, we just felt led of the Savior. These are our Savior's people. And but these were our Savior, really, our Savior's people, and we were obligated to do whatever we could to save them. Never realizing what? That they were also brethren to those they were saving. This is the awesome plan of God, and it's the plan that's going to come to full fruition, I believe, not too long hence. If you enjoyed class tonight, if you were touched, if you have thoughts, maybe you, as we were studying, you there began to connect dots or something, maybe you have comments, maybe you have questions, please call us or write them down and send them in. I would love to get your comments and your questions. If you want to give in response to the teaching you've received, you can either give to the Joash chest that's here in the classroom, or there's a drop box in the lobby of the church if you're local and want to drop it off, or you can mail it in. I hope that your faith is being stirred as we do these studies. And I hope you understand that God has a marvelous plan that He is bringing into full fruition. And I don't know about you, but I am so glad and grateful that God has allowed us to be alive at this time in this history. Have a wonderful evening. God bless you.